The wind on the prairie has a way of telling stories, but that morning it only carried a warning. Thomas Morgan stood on his porch, the cold tin of his coffee cup a familiar weight in his hand. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his shoulders broad from work, his eyes hollowed out by a silence that had moved in 2 years ago and never left. The ranch was a ghost, its fences leaning, its gate groaning, the house behind him too big, too empty. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of his world. A woman, on foot. This was a place you arrived on horseback or not at all. Yet here she was, walking against that bitter wind as if she had no other choice. She was small, wrapped in a thin shawl, but her steps were steady, defiant. In her arms she carried a bundle, an infant tucked close against the cold. Dust clung to her skirt, a map of a long, hard road. She didn't look broken, just relentless. She reached the gate and her hand rested on the weathered wood. A brief pause before she lifted her eyes to meet his. "Morning," she said, her voice clear despite the wind. "Name's Clara. This is Jonah." The baby stirred, a small life in a vast, empty landscape. "We've been walking a while." Thomas didn't move. He'd learned the hard way that the world gives nothing for free. "You headed somewhere?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Her answer came quick, too quick. "Here, for now. If you'll have us." She saw the wall go up in his eyes and rushed to add, "I'm not asking for charity. I can cook, I can mend, I can clean. I'll sleep in the barn. Just a roof for him, and a day where the ground stops moving under my feet." It was a practice speech, one she'd likely given before. But before Thomas could deliver the flat, final no that lived on his tongue, the screen door slapped open behind him. A flash of blonde curls and bare feet shot past him. "Papa!" Ellie, his 4-year-old daughter, a tiny storm of questions and energy, darted across the yard. "Ellie, stay back," Thomas started, but it was too late. The girl skidded to a halt just before the stranger, her head tilted, studying Clara with the intense gravity only a child possesses. Clara's guarded expression softened just a fraction. She looked down at Ellie, and for a moment the hardness in her face melted away. Jonah made a soft, hungry noise, and Ellie edged closer. Her small fingers reached out and pinched the hem of Clara's worn skirt. She leaned in, took a deep breath, and then turned to her father, her face lit with absolute certainty. "She smells like Mama," Ellie announced, her small voice cutting through the wind and 2 years of suffocating grief. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Mama. A name that was buried behind the cottonwoods, a word that hadn't been spoken aloud on this porch since the day the world tilted and never set itself right. He saw Clara flinch, her eyes dropping. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The apology meant for a wound she couldn't possibly understand. "I shouldn't have." Thomas finally moved, stepping off the porch, his boots crunching on the thin layer of frost. He saw the scuffed boots, the determined set of her jaw, the way she instinctively shielded the baby from the wind. He was a man who had forgotten how to ask for help, and he'd forgotten what it looked like to be the one asked. "You got people looking for you?" he asked, the question a test. "No, sir," she said, her voice steady again. "No one's looking. Your husband," the words were grit in his mouth, "gone. Before the first snow." That was all. A life story in 5 words. She just kept walking. Ellie hadn't moved. She was still holding on to Clara's skirt, a tiny anchor in a shifting world. Clara shifted her weight, the brief hope in her eyes fading. She was already turning to leave. "Thank you for your time," she said, her back straightening as she prepared for the long walk to nowhere. But Ellie moved faster. She threw both arms around Clara's legs, a fierce, desperate hug. "Don't go," she pleaded. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a simple, unbreakable truth. Clara froze, her eyes meeting Thomas's over his daughter's head, and in that look, he saw it. Not weakness, not desperation. He saw the kind of stubborn courage that got you through the night when a baby was sick, the kind that scrubbed floors and mended clothes and simply refused to break. He saw the ghost of a life he used to know. Thomas strode to the gate and pulled it open. The hinges screamed in protest. "The bunkhouse," he said, his voice gruff as he nodded toward a small outbuilding. "It's not much, but it's warm." Clara just stared, blinking, as if yes was the one word she hadn't prepared for. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said, glancing at Ellie, who was now beaming, certain she had just performed a miracle. Ellie slipped her hand into Clara's free one, and the three of them, a broken man, a wandering woman, and a hopeful child, walked through the gate together. And for the first time in 2 years, the house behind Thomas Morgan felt a little less like a tomb. It felt almost like a home waiting to be woken up. By the second day, the bunkhouse had transformed. It was still small, still drafty, but Clara had worked a quiet magic on it. Blankets were folded into sharp corners, the old stove was scrubbed clean, and Jonah's makeshift cradle was placed where the morning sun would touch it first. She moved with a silent, relentless efficiency that filled the void Thomas had grown accustomed to. She oiled the squeaking back door hinge he'd ignored for months. She mended a tear in Ellie's dress with thread pulled from an old curtain. She cooked simple, hearty meals that tasted of something more than just survival. Ellie was her shadow, a constant chattering companion. The girl who had grown quiet and withdrawn now blossomed in Clara's presence. For Thomas, who had sealed himself off with work and silence, watching them was like watching the first spring thaw after a long, brutal winter. He found himself lingering, watching the easy way Clara managed both children, a hum on her lips as she stirred a pot, her hands never still. One morning, he rode the 10 miles into town, telling himself he needed nails. He came back with a small, carefully wrapped parcel. A few hours later, Ellie burst from the bunkhouse, twirling in a soft blue dress, the lace at the cuffs a touch too long but perfect, all the same. "Papa, look!" she yelled, her laughter echoing in the quiet yard. "Mama Clara fixed it for me." Mama Clara. The name hung in the air. Thomas saw Clara in the doorway, her cheeks flushed, and he quickly looked away, tipping his hat lower to hide the storm in his chest. He had bought the dress, of course, slipping it into his saddlebag when no one was looking. Seeing his daughter so full of joy was a feeling so sharp it was almost pain. It was a happiness he thought was buried forever. The title wasn't a replacement for the wife he'd lost. It was something new, a word Ellie had invented to describe the warmth that had seeped back into their lives. And though it tore at an old wound, it also felt like a suture, pulling the ragged edges of his life back together. He didn't correct his daughter. He couldn't. Not when her smile was the brightest thing he'd seen in years. That quiet acceptance was a turning point. It was the moment he stopped seeing Clara as a temporary guest and started seeing her as something more. But the prairie holds its secrets close, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him that Clara was holding hers even closer. The woman who could make a home out of nothing surely came from somewhere, and he was beginning to suspect she hadn't just been walking away from poverty. She was running. The test came on a night when the sky split open with thunder. Ellie woke with a fever, her small body hot to the touch, her cries weak and frightened. Before Thomas could even get his boots on, Clara was there. She knelt by the bed, a cool cloth on Ellie's forehead, her voice a low, soothing hum that seemed to push back the storm. She held Jonah in one arm and gathered a whimpering Ellie into the other, creating a small island of calm in the chaos. When Thomas finally came downstairs, shotgun in hand, ready for a threat he could fight, the sight in the kitchen stopped him cold. Clara was sitting on the floor, both children asleep against her, their small bodies rising and falling with her steady breath. The lantern light softened the tired lines on her face, making her look almost peaceful. He stood there for a long time, just watching. Three strangers who, in the space of a few weeks, looked more like a family than anything he could remember. He didn't speak. He just pulled a heavy blanket from the sofa and draped it over all three of them. His hand hovered over her shoulder for a heartbeat, an unspoken acknowledgement, before he pulled back. In that moment he knew. He could no longer deny it. This woman was becoming the heart of his home. The next evening he found her scrubbing a blackened kettle with a fierce determination, her silence filling the room. He leaned against the door frame. "You don't talk much about where you came from," he said, his voice quiet. Her hands stilled. Not much to tell. But he didn't move. He just waited. And so the story came out, not in a rush, but in broken pieces. A father lost to drink and sorrow. A mother taken too soon. A marriage that was meant to be an escape but became just another cage. And a husband who vanished the moment he learned a child was on the way. She'd been walking ever since, putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant giving up. When she finished, she finally looked at him, her eyes raw and unguarded. And for the first time, Thomas shared his own story. He spoke of his wife, Jane, of the desperate, frantic ride for a doctor who came too late. He spoke of sitting in this very kitchen, a screaming infant in his arms, the silence of the house a deafening roar. In that dimly lit kitchen, two pasts, both scarred by loss and betrayal, finally met. It wasn't about pity. It was about recognition. A silent understanding passed between them, a fragile trust built on the foundations of their shared grief. But just as that trust began to take root, the outside world decided to knock on their door. The whispers started small, in the glances held a second too long at the mercantile, in the way conversation stopped when they walked by. Then the whispers grew teeth. It happened at church. Thomas walked in with Clara at his side, Ellie holding her hand and Jonah bundled against her shoulder. They were a strange sight, and the town of Redemption made sure they knew it. As the service ended, Clara Finch, the town's self-appointed moral compass, a widow whose wealth was matched only by her bitterness, blocked their path. My, she drawled, her eyes raking over Clara with disdain. The Lord certainly provides, a roof over your head, a man's protection. She let the words hang in the air, a poisoned dart. Tell me, dear, is this one of those arrangements? The church went silent. Every eye was on them. Clara's face went pale, but she didn't flinch, her grip tightening on Jonah's blanket. Thomas didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the other woman. He simply adjusted the blanket around the sleeping baby and straightened to his full height. "This woman works harder than any two people in this town," he said, his voice calm and carrying to every corner of the room. "And my daughter hasn't smiled like this since her mother passed." He met Clara Finch's gaze. "Maybe you should pray on that." He took Clara's hand, a simple public gesture of allegiance, and led his family out into the sunlight, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them. They had won the battle, but Thomas knew the war was just beginning. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he had a sinking feeling that someone was about to cross it. He was right. The very next day, a rider appeared on the ridge. He was tall in the saddle, and he rode like he owned the land beneath him. He dismounted at the gate without being invited, his smile slick and predatory. "I'm looking for Clara Hart," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Tell her Emery Tate is here to collect what's his." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. She stood frozen at the window, Jonah in her arms, her face ashen. The past she had run so hard from had just ridden up to her front gate. "I thought you were dead," she whispered when she finally stepped onto the porch. Not hardly, Emery Tate replied with a chilling grin. Just been away. Heard I have a son. His eyes flickered to the bundle in her arms. He's my blood. I've come to take him home. Thomas stepped between them, his body a solid wall. You left her. You have no claim here. Emery's smile didn't waver. The law says different. He carries my name. My family in Kansas is waiting for him. Don't be a fool, Morgan. You can't stand in the way of blood. He swung back onto his horse and rode away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like smoke. That night, a terrible, familiar resolve settled over Clara. She packed her few belongings in the dark, her hands trembling. She would not bring this violence down on Thomas and Ellie. She would run again. She was just slipping the latch on the bunkhouse door when his voice stopped her. You're not going. Thomas stood in the shadows, his face unreadable. I can't fight him, Thomas, she said, her voice breaking. You won't be fighting alone, he answered, his tone quiet but unyielding. This is your home now, Clara. He's not taking your son. For the first time, someone was standing with her, not just for her. And for the first time, she believed she might not have to run forever. But belief is a fragile thing. Trouble didn't wait for the law. It came in the dead of night. The first sound was a splintering crash, followed by Clara's scream. It tore through the night, sharp and full of terror. Thomas was out of bed in an instant, grabbing the rifle from above the mantel. He burst into the main room to find the back door smashed open, a cold wind whipping through the house. Clara stood there, her hands outstretched toward an empty cradle. They took him, she choked out, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. They took Jonah. Outside, the pounding of hooves faded into the stormy darkness. Two riders disappearing into the woods. One of them clutched a small bundled shape. There was no time for a saddle. Thomas launched himself onto his horse bareback, the animal's muscles bunching beneath him as they plunged into the night. Rain lashed down, turning the trail to slick mud, but he pushed the horse harder, guided by pure, cold fury. He caught them at the creek crossing. A man was dismounting, the crying infant held awkwardly in one arm. Thomas threw himself from his horse, tackling the man into the churning water. They rolled in the mud and gravel, fists flying. But the second rider was there. A rifle butt slammed into the side of Thomas's head, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He hit the ground, dazed, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth. Stay down, rancher, a voice snarled. The man stood over him, Jonah still wailing in his arms. Just as the man turned to remount his horse, a new figure emerged from the trees. It was Clara, drenched, shaking, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that outshone the storm, and in her hands she held Thomas's heavy hunting rifle. Put him down, she commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. The kidnapper froze, stunned. Her hands weren't shaking. The rifle was steady, aimed squarely at his chest. He hesitated, a flicker of fear in his eyes. That hesitation cost him. Clara didn't shoot him. Instead, she raised the barrel and fired into the air. The blast was deafening, a crack of man-made thunder that echoed through the valley. And the valley answered. A light flickered on in a distant farmhouse. Then another. Dogs began to bark, a frantic, rising chorus. Within minutes, lanterns were bobbing through the trees as neighbors, roused by the gunshot, came running. "Drop the boy!" a farmer shouted, leveling his own shotgun. Surrounded, outnumbered, the kidnapper's nerve broke. He slowly, carefully, lowered the crying baby into Clara's waiting arms. She clutched Jonah to her chest, burying her face in his blanket, whispering his name over and over. Just then, Emery Tate himself pushed through the crowd of ranchers. "She's lying," he yelled, his voice slick with outrage. "She stole him from me. He's my son, by law and by blood." But no one moved to help him. The townspeople had seen enough. They saw the blood streaming from Thomas's temple as he staggered to his feet. They saw the terror and relief on Clara's face. They saw a mother who had run into a storm to save her child. "Looks to me like she's the one protecting him," someone muttered. "You best ride on, Tate," the farmer said, his voice cold as iron, "before someone in this valley decides to aim a little lower." Emery looked at the hard, unyielding faces surrounding him. The verdict had been passed, not by a judge, but by a community. With a curse, he wrenched his horse around and disappeared into the night, a bitter, empty threat. In the silence that followed, Clara held her son. Thomas stood beside her, and for the first time, they were not alone. The town of Redemption had finally chosen a side. The aftermath of the attack clung to the ranch like the damp morning fog. Thomas's head throbbed, a brutal reminder of the fight at the creek. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold dread that had settled in his gut. Emery Tate was not a man who gave up. He was a snake, and he would strike again. Clara spent the day tending to his wounds, her hands gentle, her eyes dark with a fear she tried to hide. Ellie, sensing the tension, was quiet, drawing a picture at the kitchen table with a fierce concentration. "I'm drawing us," she announced suddenly, holding up a piece of brown paper. On it were 4 stick figures under a bright yellow sun, a tall one with a hat, a smaller one with long hair, and 2 little ones holding hands in the middle. "It's our family," she said, with the simple, unshakable logic of a child. The word hung in the air between Thomas and Clara. Family. It was a truth a 4-year-old could see, but a truth the world seemed determined to tear apart. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and Thomas felt a protective instinct so powerful it took his breath away. He would not let anyone destroy this. But the next blow didn't come from the barrel of a gun. It came on a piece of paper, delivered by a grim-faced deputy. Emery Tate had filed a formal custody petition with the circuit court. The document was a masterpiece of lies, painting Clara as an unstable, immoral vagrant, unfit to be a mother. And to twist the knife, it included signed affidavits from several townspeople, people who had smiled at her in the street, people whose cruelty was now etched in ink. Clara's hands shook as she read it. "He can't win," she whispered, her voice a fragile plea. "He won't," Thomas said, his own voice a low growl. He immediately sent a wire to an old lawyer friend in Denver, a man known for taking on impossible fights. But the lawyer's reply was sobering. Tate came from a wealthy, influential family. The law often favored blood and money over love and sweat. Their chances were slim. That night, the smell of smoke woke them. It wasn't firewood. It was the acrid, choking smell of burning hay. Ellie's scream split the darkness. The barn. From the window, they could see it. Flames, orange and angry, were already chewing through the roof of the grain store, a building perilously close to the main house. Clara's blood ran cold. That afternoon, to escape the heat, she had moved Jonah's crib into the cool, stone-walled pantry attached to the store. "Jonah!" she screamed. She didn't wait for Thomas. She bolted out the door, barefoot, her only thought the child sleeping in the path of the fire. The heat was a physical wall, the air thick with smoke and raining embers. She kicked the pantry door open, the wood splintering under her foot. Inside, the smoke was a blinding, suffocating cloud, but she could hear Jonah's terrified cries. She scooped him out of the crib, wrapping him in her shawl, shielding his face as she stumbled back out into the night, her lungs screaming for air. Near the creek, a new nightmare was unfolding. Thomas was locked in a brutal fight with one of the arsonists. Fists flew, grunts of pain lost in the roar of the fire. Then a glint of steel. A knife flashed in the firelight, slicing across Thomas's ribs. He staggered back, a searing pain shooting through his side, but he managed to land one final desperate blow, sending the attacker to the ground. He turned, his shirt already dark with blood, his eyes searching frantically for Clara and the children. He saw them, safe near the house, and only then did his legs begin to buckle. By dawn, the grain store was a smoldering ruin. The lawyer from Denver arrived to find a scene of devastation. Thomas was pale and weak, leaning heavily on the porch rail, the fire in his eyes dimmed by pain and blood loss. "Good God, Morgan, you need a doctor, not a lawyer," the man said, taking in the makeshift bandage around his ribs. "No time," Thomas rasped. "The hearing is tomorrow." He wouldn't go. He wouldn't risk missing the hearing, not even for a wound that could kill him. He gripped Clara's hand, his touch surprisingly strong. "If we lose him, none of this matters." That night, the house felt like a fortress under siege. Clara cleaned and bound Thomas's wound, her hands trembling, her tears falling silently onto the white bandages. He didn't speak, just held her gaze, his resolve a silent promise. They were broken, battered, and on the verge of losing everything. But in the ashes of their barn, a new kind of strength had been forged. Tomorrow they would walk into that courtroom, not with money or power, but with the simple, undeniable truth of a family that had bled to stay together. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of whispers and stares. Emery Tate sat at the plaintiff's table, looking calm and respectable in a tailored suit, his lawyer a sharp-eyed predator. He methodically built his case, calling witnesses who painted Clara as a reckless drifter. Clara Finch took the stand, her voice dripping with venom as she spoke of questionable arrangements and a lack of moral character. With every lie, Clara felt herself shrinking, the town's judgment a physical weight crushing her. She held Jonah tighter, her only anchor in a sea of condemnation. Then it was Thomas's turn. He rose slowly, leaning on a simple wooden cane, his face pale but his eyes burning. The courtroom fell silent as he made his way to the witness stand, each step an obvious effort. He didn't look at the lawyer. He looked directly at the judge. "My name is Thomas Morgan," he began, his voice quiet but carrying a strength that defied his injuries. "I am not Jonah's father, not by blood." He paused, taking a steadying breath. "But for the last several months, I've watched Clara Hart be his mother. I saw her walk miles in worn-out boots to find him a safe place to sleep. I've seen her work until her hands were raw to put food on the table. I saw her run into a burning building to save his life." He gestured to the bandage visible beneath his shirt. "And I got this wound fighting the man Emery Tate hired to set that fire." A gasp rippled through the room. Emery jumped to his feet, shouting denials, but the judge slammed his gavel, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "Emery Tate talks about blood," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "But blood doesn't make a father. Showing up does. Protecting does. Loving does. Emery Tate abandoned his son. Clara never has. She is his mother in every way that God in this world should recognize." He locked eyes with the judge. "Your Honor, you can look at the law or you can look at the truth. They aren't always the same thing." The silence that followed was absolute. The judge stared at Thomas, then at Clara clutching her son, then at Emery Tate, whose confident smirk had finally vanished. He cleared his throat, and the sound was like a crack of thunder. "I have heard enough," the judge said, his voice ringing with finality. "Custody of the child will remain with his mother, Clara Hart. Furthermore, I am ordering the sheriff to open a full investigation into the allegations of arson and assault against Mr. Tate." The gavel came down. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Clara burst into tears, tears of relief and exhaustion. Ellie scrambled into her lap, wrapping her arms around both her and Jonah. Thomas limped over, placing a steady hand on Clara's shoulder. In his eyes, she saw not just victory, but a promise. The storm was over. They had won. Spring came to the Morgan Ranch, not as a season, but as a promise fulfilled. The new grass grew over the scorched earth where the grain store had stood, and wildflowers bloomed along the creek bank. Inside the house, the rhythm of life found a new, quiet cadence. The air was filled with the sounds of Ellie's laughter, Jonah's happy gurgles, and the low hum of Thomas working to repair a broken chair. The ghosts that had haunted the corners of the rooms seemed to have faded, replaced by the warmth of fresh-baked bread and the scent of laundry drying in the sun. One evening at the supper table, Ellie leaned over and, in a now familiar ritual, sniffed Clara's sleeve. "You smell like Mama," she whispered contentedly. Before, the words had been a shock, a memory of a painful past. But now, they felt different. They felt like a statement of fact. Thomas looked across the table at Clara, whose eyes were shining. He reached out and covered her hand with his. "She does, Ellie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She really does." Later that night, they sat on the porch. Thomas had finally repaired the old swing, and next to it, he had built a second one. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, they rocked in a gentle, companionable silence. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, Jonah asleep in her arms. "I came here thinking I just needed to survive," she said softly. "But this is living." Thomas didn't answer with words. He simply wrapped his arm around her, pulling her and the children closer. They were a patchwork family, stitched together by hardship and hope, their bonds forged not by law or by blood, but by choice. They had faced down judgment, violence, and fire, and they had come out the other side, stronger and whole. The prairie wind still whispered its stories, but now it carried a new one. It was a story about how home isn't a place you find, but a thing you build, sometimes out of the most broken pieces. And if you've ever felt lost and wondered if you'd ever find your place, just remember Thomas and Clara. Remember that the most beautiful families are often the ones we choose for ourselves. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, because love and courage can bloom in the most unexpected of places.